Hello, I'm David Eichholtz with David Richard Gallery, located in New York City. And today I'm joined by Laura Watt. And Laura's new to the gallery, and this is her first solo show with our gallery. It's called Hide and Seek. And we're going to talk about the show today that's curatorially comprised of two bodies of work, but they're aesthetically related, formally in many ways, but also conceptually. And I think that's the underpinning we want to focus on in this discussion today. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you, thank you.
And Laura lives upstate New York, not too far away from New York City, and her studio is up there as well.
Yep.
And I've been following Laura for quite a while actually on Instagram, and we just kind of finally connected and talking back and forth, and I went to view the work. And I really just went up to do a studio visit, and these two bodies of work, this body that we're standing in front of right here, called Open Ceiling Series, were sort of in a stack together, and I was quite taken with them because I just have this affinity to geometry and grids, and so immediately caught my eye. And we were talking, and then there was another body of work sort of scattered through your studio, and some in a corner that you'd put away, which she calls the Hide series, and you can't see those from here, but we will talk about those in a separate segment. And I realized curatorially the link between the two, and then the more we started talking, there was also this conceptual link. And so that's what we'd like to drill down a bit on today. So the Open Ceiling series, there's 6 paintings in the series. We're standing in front of 4 right here. They're all 30 by 30 square, and it's sort of diamond and cross shapes. And they read a lot like crosses, mandalas, spider webs, and there's a lot of just very discrete, like this piece here, where it's just very discrete lines and very classic sort of. So I say it's a grid because it is structured and regimented. Yeah. And they're kind of neutral backgrounds. They're not as eye-popping as a lot of other things you do, although they are eye-popping because of the strong contrast and the compositions. It's just here you've really subdued the color. And so I want you to kind of talk about that because it was very interesting when you explained to me, because these do look very different. Mm-hmm. You can tell it's sort of your hand because you don't do things where you're regimented throughout the whole process. Are some things that are very regimented, like this concentric squares that are on the diamond. Right. But then it loosens up, but yet it's structured. They look like feathers. They look like, cobwebs. Honeycombs, all sorts of things. And but what was interesting is these kind of came out of sort of a mourning process you were going through. Right,
they did. I had recently lost my mother, and we had moved from Philadelphia. So I was setting up a new studio and dealing with that kind of mourning process and grief, and also I had been working on some really complicated, big, colorful paintings in Philadelphia. So it was a matter of paring back down, as you always do. You kind of go back to the beginning, and
this was in 2016, I should say.
Yeah, so we moved in the winter, so there was that kind of quiet space of the winter. So all of those pieces fell in place to kind of really examine very simple structures and very limited color and palette. And I really. My work is so color-based that I needed that challenge, kind of what's working underneath the color, what's there that's not specific, is not the wham of two colors interacting. What's this, how do you build a kind of a more subtle space that opens up slower through hue and value and hue. So that's where these came from, and I had worked, you mentioned earlier, series really specifically with kind of a mandala and a cross, and in these it really was dealing with the diamond and then that cross structure. More than the mandala, because the mandala often that circular speaks to kind of expansion. And these I really wanted to deal with the confinement of the square. So I kept it to the geometry.
I just haven't, because you mentioned something when we were in your studio, and then I also asked you just to write down some of your own personal thoughts after we had met. And
Right.
a couple of weeks, later, so I could write the press release and sort of think about my own writing. And you said something in there, because I was kind of wondering, you're very geometrically oriented anyway.
Right.
And which of course appealed to me, and I love color. What really zinged me in on you though is some paintings that are not in this show, but we will show them, are very trippy.
Yes.
And very psychedelia. And
Yeah.
I'm completely enamored with psychedelia. And so, so that really drew me in. But now these are obviously a significant departure from that.
Yes.
No, not a significant departure, but
Yeah.
But what was caught my ear, or eye, I should say, in the reading is you went to this, back to this. One is you can see the palettes because there's some solitude there and quiet time. But the other thing you said too, which was interesting, is you needed to organize sort of your thoughts and compartmentalize. And so I realized that geometry was sort of a way to you to do that. But you also made a comment around, because your paintings earlier on looked like quilts, and it came out of sort of your interest and passion in sort of sewing and textiles, and you did like quilts. And so that geometry kind of came out of that. And so you had mentioned too then that the patterning and arrangements sort of help codify sort of how you were compartmentalizing your feelings and thoughts.
Yeah.
So I thought that was sort of interesting, but the one thing I hadn't thought about until just now, while we're standing here, which is what I like about these chats, is the crosses though. Was the cross a religiosity sort of feeling, or because of death or mourning?
All of the above.
Okay.
I mean, there is that. I think at the time I made them, I would not probably have brought that up, as an overt conversation, but it's definitely there. I first kind of started using the cross that's basically what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares, that breaks up the square. So every part of the cross, what I'm trying to say, is the same unit. Doing a project that involved the Red Cross. So I was looking at their cross. And
that's right.
so that's where it first came in. But with these also, I was definitely thinking of religious ceilings and sacred spaces. And my mother was a very devout Episcopalian, and her faith was very important. So I think the fact that you actually see it more here, there's a real energy that kind of cross brings. It speaks directly to kind of, this is a cross. These are about, a formal. There's when you were saying a kind of a way of codifying, I think this was a way to formally process grieving too. Is there are steps, there's structures, there's cycles you go through. So.
Oh dear, there's only 6 paintings here, so you have 6 more to go. Like all good programs.
I decided that I think I figured out that 8 is my kind of 8 years is my mourning period. But it was because the grid is so often, it is it's a way to place things and to catch things, and it's kind of how you find your space. The grid to me is as much a map of how you find yourself in the painting, me as the painter and the viewer and so forth.
And spider webs are sort of a way of catching and grabbing things.
Yeah,
so you
we
don't forget.
we love the dumb cliches and metaphors. Pile them on.
But the other thing too, what's interesting about these is then how you named them, which was ceilings. So ceilings convey a lot of things. My initial thought when you said ceiling was like a glass ceiling. I mean, it's a limitation.
Right.
It's a boundary. But then I thought, and then when I read more about how you were thinking about this in terms of a grieving process, I realized, well, then there's the shelter aspect of it. It's sort of protection. So it does 2 things. It protects you from things, but it also can limit you.
Yeah.
And then you made a statement then that the way you looked at these, especially like with some of these that are more like web structures and things like this, where you saw like breaks through the ceiling so you could kind of find a way out. And so that's where those sort of thoughts, what sort of start tying into the other series that's part of this show, which is the Hyde series.
Yeah.
And so, so say more about that. I mean, you saw that, like usually when we think of limitations, it's sort of your cap. You can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And so.
And I think that's is in the paintings, but it's more, as was in the press release, this desire for both an interior and exterior space. And in these also that feeling of being in a confined space, and this, but there's a ceiling, it can give you a sense of above the space outside of your interior confinement that's both protective and confinement. It's confinement. But there's just that kind of frustration, that like a really good ceiling gives you the sense of the expanse, but you're still interior. So I guess what I'm trying to say is with these, it really was, to me, they're very internal looking out. They have a very kind of trying to find ways out of specific situation. That speaks to kind of, that inside interior space and then outside. Whereas the Hydes that we'll look at, they move out into the world more. They're much more.
And the other thing too that I think these are more structured and rigid than you typically do. Normally things have a little bit more fluidity to them or movement, but they always have sort of grids and structures. You always have geometry in your work, and sometimes it's multi-layered, and we'll see that in the Hydes.
Yeah.
Whereas these are sort of, this is sort of multi-layered.
Yeah.
But there are discrete quadrants where they're pure.
Yes.
And one of the things you also made a comment when we were having the studio visit was you like creating new spaces or finding ways of geometry and the color and these manipulations where sometimes you start morphing into something more biomorphic, or not biomorphic, but biological, that it creates these sort of things. And so you start seeing that happening. This one's a good example where these shapes here, which sort of feel like somewhat like feathers, but they're like boxes on boxes on boxes on boxes, and they're sort of each kind of like twisting around, or rectangles. And but what happens is when you do that, they sort of start softening up a bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. And then again, it goes from this rigidity, which is still maintained in the cross. But what happens is these start getting softer though. And part of it's the palette, but part of it too is that geometry starts getting sort of morphed and softer. And you do that a lot in your work.
Yes,
And so it's like, you also like this dance with nature and biology and structure, which is not crazy because you think of, we've already talked about some honeycombs, spider webs, they're very regimented, but they're not exactly perfect. I mean, all biology is symmetrical, but it starts sort of morphing, and you sort of play off of those sort of morphs and changes, it seems like a lot.
Absolutely, and the kind of the different movements of different geometries, so kind of a triangle versus a square, and the dynamic nature of a triangle and what you can build. And here it was so about like, let's not do so many layers to find it. Where does it start to change from the building structure, pitting up your scaffolding, until where you're starting to see new shape coming, as you say, the softening of the geometries, also these new shapes coming out of the intersections of the lines. So with this, it got pared down enough. Basically it's really working with one geometric structure, like the initial grid, and then maybe an overlay of in these, as we said, the diamond lines going back, or the radiation from the center, and then that. But really, it's basically one or two systems, and then manipulating that within it with color by kind of well, yeah, it is manipulating. It's manipulating how you kind of see it and the shape of it with just color, color value. Then when you get into the more where it's, grid system on top of grid system on top of grid system. So this kind of brought me to how much do I need to actually start to see new form? And it's very little. You start to see it in the way, as you say, this starts to break up and read as a different space, and then changes the way the gray and black work in this one as opposed to here, and then in the one you're standing right by, just that subtle kind of quality of the surface here. I've got that was a very new kind of space for me to deal with in a
This
painting.
one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because the surface that I had been working with a grid that moved the surface kind of this way in and out, and here you have this modulated surface that allows you, to look, where am I standing? Am I looking down? Am I looking up?
Right.
So it was it was a really when I look back at it, it was a really informative group of work to kind of give myself such tight parameters.
Well, a lot of artists like that.
Yeah.
There are many artists who set a rigorous set of criteria and force themselves to stay in that.
Well, you've got to do something to
To-
fill the time in the studio.
Well, no, but
They're long
what it
days,
does
yeah.
is it forces you to think about how you solve that problem multiple ways.
Exactly.
So John Mendelsohn was a show we had upstairs.
Yes, yeah.
Just before this show, and John Yao had written a review about it. And what was interesting is he picked up right away that John works in series, and he works with certain constraints. Like he had two different series up there. One was striations
Yes,
of
yeah,
lines,
yeah.
and the other was circles.
Yeah.
And the color relationships within circles. And it was sort of interesting how and they're sort of systemic, but not overly so. He kind of gets the jive within 8 to 10 or 12 paintings of what he wants to do, and he sort of resolves it in his mind as opposed to making it a lifelong project. But he works that way to look at variations between either color, shape, light, whatever, and sort of works through them. But he does it within this confine of a certain shape of canvas, a certain device, whether it be a line or a circle or whatever, or a certain tool where there's like a comb pulling through,
Yeah.
or a single color on a certain ground, and a device that spreads the color, and so he has these different parameters.
Right.
But one thing I kind of thought about with your work is you're sort of the same way in here, and one of the things that I'm curious about is these do have an optical quality to them, and so do you consciously think about that, or do you how do I word this? Do you purposely do that, or do you use it as a device to sort of activate or create this tension between different parts of a painting? And what I'm thinking about there is like op art artists.
Yep.
Like Julian Stanczyk's a great example. He would do these overlays of like dashes or diamonds or raised elements or whatever. And what it does is it activates your eye, and it makes the power of suggestion much greater. So looking at this is a good example. And I'm pointing out this one because it shows up better on the video because it's so graphic.
Yeah.
But this is very strong in the way it's radiating, and
Yep.
it becomes very optical, and also the fact that you have this strong contrast. So you automatically have like a push-pull going on. Is it two-dimensional? Is it three-dimensional?
You're right.
And is it spinning? Is it
Yeah.
static? Whatever.
Yeah.
And then what it does is, I'm wondering then, do I read these differently now because of that? You know what I'm saying? Versus if this painting had just been these shapes radiating out in just 4 quadrants. Do they read more soft, more biological, less rigid, because that is so rigid and so optical? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does
And
that,
the answer is yes.
to all of the above?
Yeah, yes, but it definitely, and yes, the answer is just yes to everything.
I choose
expanding.
E, all of the above.
But having paintings, I have in other paintings, basically that radiation like that, and it doesn't work the same way. It's
So the activation does do something,
yes,
and I'm noticing, did you purposely do that
Yeah.
here to make that more
they were specific.
illusory?
Yep, the kind of work prior to this, I was realizing that I really had to, I was looking at dealing with op art and that visual energy. I was getting,
You
know.
did think about that?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay,
And
I was wondering.
And it was one of those.
Okay.
No, that's kind of, it's always surprising where you find yourself as a painter kind of after, you know, a number of years in your schooling. You're like, oh, I'm a geometric abstractionist. Who knew?
Well, you came out of Yale, which is the home of Joseph Albers, which is where Richard Anaskevich and Julian Stanczak and a lot of these guys studied.
Yeah,
They were all
but I have to
students.
show you my paintings at Yale, from Yale. You would never know that. But I realized that I really was dealing with issues that the op artists were, and that I need to look at it. You know, I needed to have a little more control of it.
So in a way, then, this overlay of this sort of rigorous...
You're looking at my rudimentary lessons in op art, how to make an op art
No, but what it
painting.
does is, it does exactly that. It activates your eye.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
how Julian Stanczak always thought about these sort of uniformity things that look... In and of themselves, they would be sort of like, that's not so hot.
Yeah.
But when it's layered with different, contrasting between color or other shapes, it activates the eye, and so the eye becomes much more suggestive to potential of illusory depth or volumetric space, even though it's on a flat picture plane. And that's more potent than any of them.
Yeah,
That's rock'em sock'em. But
Yeah.
it made me realize I'm reading this in a much more active way and thinking about it in a much more active way because of that.
Yeah.
And the same thing here. And it didn't catch me until standing here next to it. And when you're sitting here looking at it with the raking light like we talked about with this one, these really stand out way more than if you're standing away and looking on it.
Yeah, but they do, even on, I find with that, it's probably hard to see in the video, but the green, that interaction with that green and red, these just read so much more dimensionally than they would without that green on top. You know, I really feel kind of the crevices in between all those kind of diamonds moving in shape that is from that kind of vibration with the red and green.
And this is, and because, well, in here, and it's kind of interesting that the shapes are different and they're on different layers, but you do get that activation not only because of the rigidity of the line and it's breaking across these, but also because of the colors you said. But I happen to notice over here too, you use red and green again.
Yeah.
And was this a conscious decision to keep these all sort of the same value?
Yes, yeah.
Now that pink is a little lighter, but by and large, that's what really kicks up the energy too, by the way. But your fact that you picked reds and greens and the same value, that was a conscious decision?
Because
you get a little bit of a vibration.
You get that, you get that nice shake, you know, and it
so
is.
There's a lot going on in these. There's
and it's interesting because there's so much really. I think when I realized that's what interested me about the op art paintings is that space where you can feel it. And I was at a show of Bridget Riley's in Scotland with my daughter when she was over there, and it was fascinating to go through the show with my daughter Lydia because she was really physically affected by some of the black and whites. Like they made her sick. Like, well, not like throw up, but I mean, she felt them physically, and I'd never been with anybody that had that reaction. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. But I mean, I think since the way I've tried to use it is to get those slips. So you kind of change focus a bit. It's to go back to the psychedelic too. It's kind of that like, the hippie talk of a seed potency. It's right, you know, these are our little seed crystals.
That hippie talk, like those people.
I'm a bonafide good old hippie.
Same here. That's why when people say, "Oh, I have this physical response when I look at those," I'm going, "Really?" You know, and it's just like, because I'm just like, man, bring on more layers.
Yeah,
you
no,
know?
I know. It was.
I'm like a plaid on plaid guy.
It was really revealing to me because I just like soak it in and get such a buzz from that, and Lydia was just like, I've got to leave. They're really making me kind of have vertigo. I know. I was like, wow, it works.
the other
we
thing
can
too
manipulate
is it does
you.
make these paintings really bigger. I mean,
Yeah.
they gobble up a lot more visual space,
Yeah.
you know, on a wall, which is great. I mean, because there's so much going on in them. So we didn't talk about that before. So that was sort of something new that it dawned on me over the last couple of days that I should talk to you about more, because I read them kind of optically and
Yeah.
with sort of a visual perception issue,
Yeah.
or sort of take on it, or illusory, I should say. And so it's kind of nice to know that actually was sort of in the back of your
I'm
mind.
very glad you brought it up, because it also, I don't think I'd ever bring it up because I'm such an amateur compared to, really good op paintings that just kind of bliss
Well,
you
in my
out.
writing,
But there's not the same. I don't want the same end, but I'm thrilled that
I didn't pick up
you
on the green here because I
yeah.
wrote about only red and blue.
Yeah.
And
That's a really lovely tricky green, that phthalo,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it pulls blue, it's pulling a lot of blue there from the
Well,
background.
I'm definitely
It's
going to
great.
bring some more things in, but I told you that what drew me to these was the fact that I've always loved op art, and the gallery's always been focused on basically movements that emerged through the 60s, 70s,
Right,
and 80s and
right.
90s. That's sort of my passion and sweet spot, and that's what I collect largely. And so I've always loved the work of Julian Stanczak and Richard Anaskevich and Ed
Yeah.
Machowski and Ernst Benkert and all of these guys, and I love all of that. And so and that's why I said I think a lot of my collectors would have sort of this kinship with these very immediately
yeah.
because of the structure, the geometry,
Yeah.
but also I saw them as very optical and illusory, but we really didn't ever talk
No.
about that.
No.
But it was just more now that I've had them here in the gallery and been looking at them more closely.
Oh, it's funny because sorry to interrupt you, but it's also,
No,
I'm
it's
like,
fine.
oh gosh, the secret's out of the bag, because there is a way that, paintings are so wham bam at first that, they're always like op art's always kind of thrown in the corner, and it's like there's so much there, and that was only the beginning of it. So it's kind of like, shh, don't, we've got a lot we can play with there. So it's my
Well,
private
I think
bag.
part of what's different about yours is you didn't go pure black and white.
Yeah.
You went neutrals. And that's not typical. Usually it's either very, very strong color contrast to get that,
Yeah.
that color interaction and vibrational effect, or black and white,
Yeah.
which you can't
Yeah.
get any more contrast
Yeah.
than that. And then doing things like, Bridget did, and Julian did that too, the real sinewy sort
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
parallel lines that
Yeah.
start deviating. Then it looks like it's sort of folding in and out. And those paintings that John had upstairs, those striated ones,
Yeah.
that's exactly what
Yeah.
those did.
Yeah.
Those to me harken back to the 60s and Bridget Riley and Julian
Yeah.
Stanczak and people using line, and then a very subtle shift here and there makes it look like it's undulating,
Mm-hmm.
and then it becomes, and then they would play with the thickness, and then it's like, oh, is it coming at me? Is it moving back?
Yeah.
And then it doesn't take much, even just in black and white, for something to look like it's three-dimensional.
Right.
It looks
right.
like fabric or hair or yarn.
Yeah.
And these undulations, and so it's very powerful.
It is. It
And,
is.
and I enjoyed a great
Yeah.
deal. So, but once things get out into the space, we were talking about this with the last show that was here. A lot of people kept making references to abstract expressionism. He didn't really see his work that way. But I said, but when it goes out into the world, everyone reacts to it differently, and that's a good thing because everybody, art trips a different wire in all of us, and it just depends on your memory, in exhibitions that you saw years ago or things at a museum or in your grandparents' or your parents' house or whatever.
Right.
All those things trigger all these different sort of feelings and thoughts. And also then when you're in college, and going to art school. And, so everyone has a different read, and they look at something, and it's a combination sometimes of a stroke, a gesture, and the palette, and it triggers something. And people use a word of a movement or a period or something, and sometimes artists kind of look at them like, well, that's not what I was thinking. Well, it may not be what you were thinking, but when they're looking at it in this context, that's the vibe they get.
Yeah,
and it's not a bad thing. It's what it is.
Well,
And-
it's there.
Yeah.
And that's, paintings are these metaphorical spaces. They also can be absolutely kind of concrete and formal, but
Yeah.
within there it is. So, Yeah, I would, any way that somebody is seeing an entrance in is legitimate. I think you have to acknowledge that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And like I said to him, I said, it's out there in the world now. So
Yeah.
it's like, and however reviewers or people look at it,
Yeah.
or collectors or curators, it's okay. I mean, it's a different interpretation, and we should all just sort of welcome those things. Because I like that a lot of times when clients come in and they'll say something, I'm like, didn't think about that. I didn't see it that way.
I
but
know
I see where you're coming from, or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's just the way. That's the nice thing about art.
Yeah, especially. That's the fun thing about having paintings out is hearing what people, how they respond and see them.
Well, I love these,
different.
and it's a discrete short series, but I think it's very powerful. So I'm really glad I saw them in your studio, because it's sort of how we curated this show, and that's how I like to curate shows.
Yeah.
That's why I love going to the artist studio, as opposed to having something already sort of sent to me, and here's like 10 paintings I'd like to show, and here's what it means to me, and da-da-da-da-da. But a lot of times I like to, go to the studio and kind of take a look at things, and that's the nice thing about the show. It's 2 discrete series, although the hides, you're sort of, we'll get into it, they're kind of morphing into something else. But I think these two have a really great dialogue, and we're going to sort of move on now into the next segment and talk about the hides.
That sounds good. I think they do too, and that was what's so exciting with the studio visit, because I hadn't looked at these, as I said, and I pulled them out thinking this is going to be a nice body to show. And then, but really I had no thought of them until our studio visit, really, hadn't put them together.
The discourse, you mean, between them?
To have them
and I didn't
have
think
a
it was
conversation.
appropriate to intermingle them. I really think this is such a powerful, strong series by itself. And I think there's a certain sort of softness and similarity, yet contrast with these others. And I really felt like in the curation, I wasn't like trying to have it as a standoff between the two, but bodies
It's a pretty
good
one,
but I felt like these had to have their own space.
Yeah.
And these are sort of surrounded by the hides, and so, but I think...
Which I think is appropriate, them protecting this, because it's a much more, as I've been saying, kind of, I feel, internal space.
Well, this is a little bit more personal to you, too.
Yeah,
so.
And the scale of them is, squares I always find are kind of confounding to work with, because they're just so, they can be so inert, but then they also have that beautiful expansion. So I love, they hold a wall differently than other paintings, and a much smaller square can hold better than other paintings.
Well, I love these immediately, but I like them even more now, because there's just now a whole other layer on a formal level that we hadn't even talked about.
Yeah, no.
So it's really, I think these are quite good. So we'll, unless you have another thought you want to capture,
I think that's that really kind of explains them really well. The one thing with them, I guess, as a last, is they really, I do always work in series, but these in particular was a very discrete, kind of all started together, but then kind of progressed one after the other within a short period of time. So I think that you also feel in that kind of like, it's a complete unit. These
and I know I told you, when we do these videos, I like to talk about each sort of vignette or section as a separate thing. But one thing I am going to point out now, if anyone watches, it'll probably be on video 4, if we stay on the pace we're at. But this radiating structure, the new paintings, this is becoming very prevalent. And in fact, you posted something on Instagram, I liked yesterday or the day before.
Yes, the black,
It's more open and more negative space.
Yep.
But you're using this as a nucleating site that sort of radiates out.
Yeah.
It seems to be sort of a new thing, because the two that we're going to show later, they're not part of the curation for people who are listening. If they go to the and read the press release, they're going, what the hell are they talking about? But if you go to the website, they'll be on there for the exhibition. But anyway, it's what I wanted to point out was and the reason why I wanted to incorporate those 2 new paintings when I saw them is because I did see a kinship with these. And I've noticed, though, because and the one we even said looks like a peacock. It's sort of funny because you're using this but with that as the
Yes.
construct.
Yeah.
And so for the base of the composition, and it's a much bigger picture, but asymmetrically oriented and in a horizontal format, which you tend to like.
Yes.
But anyway, so we're going to get to that. So I'm going to come back to that.
Yeah, and that is absolutely correct. This, I mean, this is was the last painting done. It's the last in the, it's a number
And this
6.
is sort of the same thing.
Yeah,
too.
but this is really here where I'm starting to look at those, and the peacock, what we're calling the peacock.
But
painting.
you know that's
Here's a
very
clown.
psychedelia.
Yeah.
That sort of
You're
radiating
pinning
out.
me down on my. I'm just going to skirt around that for a few months.
What, the psychedelia?
Yeah. No, but yes.
Yeah, I mean the poster art from the 60s,
Oh, yeah,
which
absolutely.
I love and I have
Yeah.
a big collection of.
Yeah.
And I don't put a lot of them up because my apartment in here in New York has so much glass and so much windows. And even though I purposely got a north-facing apartment, because these are all on paper.
Yeah,
and they're fluorescent and there are these really bold, colors
And they're
blacks,
early,
and I don't
so
want them
you'll
to fade.
lose them all. Yeah.
Yeah, so I keep them sort of in a folder, and I have some that I have framed.
We're gonna have a poster party.
Have
I
museum
can't
glass
wait.
on them and stuff. But yeah, I love that. And so I thought,
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm on to you already.
I know.
Well, thanks.
Yep. Good.